Alright guys, welcome back to F1 News, and it seems we're back in 2021 again. Toto Wolff, Christian Horner going at each other's necks once again in a fiery exchange that supposedly we're going to dive into here in the coming minutes with regard to potentially the change of rules that Mercedes want to see. Red Bull's Horner says that it's just because they want to have a more competitive car. Toto Wolff seems to believe that it actually is in the benefit and the interest of all the drivers across the entire grid. But very much enjoy to your thoughts in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you enjoy, subscribe if you're new as always, I would greatly appreciate it. Really helps the channel. Thank you very much indeed for doing that. A rather entertaining Canadian Grand Prix concluded last night, but this was the kind of key discussion that was going on before the actual race got underway. On Saturday, supposedly, there was a kind of a meeting of the team bosses in Montreal. We saw before the weekend began, a technical directive comes into play from the FIA to say, okay, look, if your aerodynamic porpoising is greater than certain levels that they will set, then you will be forced to raise the right height of your car in order to deal with those issues and make sure the drivers don't have the back issues that they're experiencing, most certainly in Baku. This weekend in the race itself, though, the porpoising wasn't so bad. Well, really, the porpoising isn't actually the issue that most of the teams are suffering from. It's effectively, at least according to Mercedes, the bottoming out of the car on the floor due to the bumps on the track. A smooth track, the Mercedes is perfectly fine. And we saw that this weekend that in the smoother, newer asphalted corners around Canada is actually the Mercedes was as competitive as the top cars and on the straights. But on the kind of bumpier corners that kind of with the old asphalt, that's where they were struggling a little bit more, right? So that's kind of the key difference here that at least some people have been mentioning. But I wanted to dive into what was said about this, because this was kind of what was said coming into the weekends. That, of course, like Toto Wolff admitting that yes, Mercedes wants some changes to the rules here, whether that's kind of a change to the suspension, if they could potentially bring back last year's suspension or even an active suspension or something. I'm sure they'd kind of be pushing for here to deal with the stiffness of their car that seemingly is worse than what the other drivers are dealing with in the other cars. But it's still saying like, look, these are team bosses trying to manipulate things and play political games while the FIA tries to come up with a quick solution. It's not just us who suffers from the bounce. In Baku, that was true for a lot of teams and drivers. There was a lot of complaints about effectively the safety of the drivers. Like, he thinks effectively it's pathetic and pitiful that other team bosses are trying to manipulate this, effectively saying that Christian Horner, by denying the idea that anything needs to be changed, is effectively directly harming drivers' health. Now, of course, other people would argue that they should just fix their car, but even Pierre Gasly was saying at the time that, okay, look, the FIA is kind of forcing us at the moment to choose between driver safety and performance, right, which probably isn't what they want to do. So the FIA are deciding to step in. Now, of course, as Wolff says, of course, people are now wondering if my position is sincere or not, but Red Bull driver Perez has also complained. So that's kind of the backstory coming into the weekend. Then, of course, the race weekend comes around on Saturday. They did this kind of team meeting between the bosses, and I guess the FIA was present in there. And apparently, Netflix was also present as well. And Adam Cooper says there might be some bad acting going on. And one boss told me last year that thanks to Netflix, some of his colleagues wanted to be the next Robert De Niro. But according to Adam Cooper, from kind of sources inside this meeting, hearing more and more about an angry exchange between Toto Wolff and Mattia Binotto with regard to the porpoising technical directive at yesterday's meeting. Christian Horner joined in too, and all of this in front of the Netflix camera. So these are the details that we know about this. That one witness said Mercedes boss Wolff lost his mind, let's just say, while another reported he went into full Abu Dhabi spec, which I thought was kind of a funny way to describe it. Pretty sure it was it Jeddah where he smashed the headset, but I guess it was Abu Dhabi where he was, rather apoplectic with rage, and me understandably so, with regard to Michael Massey and some of the decisions made there. But apparently Wolff was indeed furious. Wolff and Horner are said to have clashed in the meeting, the latter having made his disgruntlement regarding the technical directive public, calling it unfair to change the rules to suit one team. Mercedes, of course, being the team that he was referring to, right, saying that, okay, look, if they're going to change the rules for any reason, that shouldn't be allowed, especially if it's, affecting Mercedes in a more positive light. Of course, the technical directive, as it turned out, is more than likely affecting Red Bull more beneficially than others, just because, if they suffer the least amount of porpoising, then they don't have to change anything, whereas other teams, such as Mercedes, if they are bouncing more, have to change things, potentially. That's kind of what we talked about a little bit ago. Another insider, though, said that Mattia Binotto had also intervened, telling Wolff he disagreed on the need for a change to the regulation simply because the Mercedes W13 has not proven successful yet. But others said that Wolff's message was delivered powerfully, if not excessively, with neither Wolff nor Horner, who equally stood his ground, establishing dominant trends. So apparently there was some sort of heated exchange, and maybe understandably so. Now, of course, this sets some further information here, like the idea that the likes of Christian Horner were manipulating what was being said by drivers to protect their competitive advantage or to gain it, calling their behaviour pitiful. I'm sure other team principals might think the same thing about Toto Wolff in this situation, right? But yeah, there's all been some drama about this, and of course, it's understandably so. The teams that are battling back and forth, right? Mercedes want things changed in their favour. Red Bull, because they're at the top, they don't want anything changed, even if it might be in the best interest of the drivers, which is kind of what Wolff was getting across. Then again, though, even with nothing changing as of yet, Mercedes did look more competitive this weekend, and maybe they just have to say, okay, look, maybe the rules aren't going to change in our favour. Maybe they are, who knows? I'm sure, as I talked about suspension, whatever it could be to kind of reduce the stiffness of the car that they're suffering with. Like, I'm sure they'll kind of be pushing for stuff like that, and Red Bull and Ferrari more than likely will be denying it, fearing, of course, that Mercedes' dominance of the last several years coming back into play. But as time progresses, if Red Bull establish dominance themselves, maybe Ferrari change their mind as to what they want to see. So that's the thing at the end of the day. Like, yes, the drivers or the team bosses theoretically have the drivers' best interests at heart, but the reality is it's a competitive sport. They're going to do what is in their best interest at the end of the day. And as Christian Horner says, to kind of cap this off, he's campaigning to change the rules. That's kind of what Ted Kravitz says as well in the notebook, that Mercedes effectively are right now are looking to get the rules changed for the rest of this year or 2023 or whatever to reduce the stiffness of these cars, and maybe they will be successful, who knows. But Horner says that's somewhat ironic though, because here Mercedes bounced much less, of course, after the race itself and were quite fast. I think their concept is the problem, not the regulations, which is rather interesting because Mercedes actually disagree with this, that their concept is the issue. It's just that kind of the implementation of that one. And even Verstappen was kind of weighing in, saying that Lewis and George Russell are speaking on behalf of the rest of the grid. That's not fair at all. They should focus on their problems without bringing others into them, right? So pretty spicy stuff, it must be said, between Red Bull and Mercedes, especially as we are rather used to at this point, right? And especially if Mercedes keep getting competitive and are challenging for race wins, I'm sure we're going to get more of this type of stuff. Now, I've got to mention this as well, because supposedly one of the commentators over at Portuguese TV was talking with Toto Wolff and kind of revealed what Wolff said about the W13. So supposedly he says, well, they were kind of on the FE paddock or whatever, Formula E paddock. Apparently Toto told Antonio they are 100% sure the concept they have in their hands is the fastest one in theory, even though it's a hard process to unlock its potential fully and fix its shortcomings. Not only that, but Toto said they will give it about 1 or 2 races after Canada, so Silverstone and the one after that, whatever that is, to make a final decision as to whether to stick with the current concept and face all of its struggles, knowing that it's a winning concept, or moving on to a different concept which is much easier to work with but has less potential, i.e. the kind of the Barcelona spec car they had right at the start of the year in the pre-season testing after yesterday's running where they finished comfortably. Like, what are the potential implications here, right? It's rather interesting. Toto Wolff seems to believe, and maybe the team believes, that their car, in theory, the design of it with the no side pod design, is the fastest one in theory if they can unlock its full potential every single race. Seems to be a massive challenge though to get this car in the right window, as they like to talk about, to actually get it working as they like to. If they can, like in Spain, then it looks pretty good. It looks like it can compete, as did, in fairness, Hamilton and Russell to a certain degree in yesterday's race as well. They were closer than they have been for, well, since Spain, obviously. But kind of in contrast to what Horner said, okay, it's your concept that is the problem, and of course it is the concept of the problem to a degree, because unlocking the potential seems very challenging, but he still believes, seemingly, that 100% they have the fastest car in theory, which is rather an interesting statement, right? Just because I'm sure, like, if he kind of says that publicly, which clearly isn't the case here, then other teams might start to look more seriously about that, right? Because next year, Mercedes, in theory, could just turn up with a Red Bull copy and hope it works. But of course, Red Bull, in theory, they can advance their design. Like, it's not going to be ideal. And of course, if Toto Wolff is correct that their design and their theory is correct, then of course other teams might start to look at that a bit more seriously about the direction they take for next year. If of course they can unlock its potential and get the setup right, which of course has been their key challenge, which maybe they'll manage to solve over the coming races, right? I'm sure that's going to be their plan, but interesting to hear about regardless. But of course, talking to Mercedes, despite all these concerns, right, the fact that, okay, they want the rules changed, and okay, this car, like, it's not great at all. Hamilton was saying it's the worst car he's ever driven round at Montreal until they kind of, well, changed and set up things, got it right for the race. George Russell says, yeah, it's a bumpy track, but weren't porpoising around like they were pre-Spain, let's say. And these were the kind of the average gap to the fastest versus the drivers of Verstappen, of course, being at 0, Sainz right behind him, less than a tenth off every lap. Of course, it doesn't tell the whole story, this, just because you've got safety cars, you've got different tyre strategies and stuff. The fact that Leclerc is like a second off the leader, that of course wouldn't be the case, but he was stuck behind Ocon for quite some time. Like, he was on towards the end of the race 25 lap old medium tyres. So like, obviously for a few reasons, Leclerc is not going to be at the same 1 lap pace as Verstappen was, for example, but it's still the two Mercedes, 0.36 off on average, 0.46 off on average for Hamilton and Russell respectively. Slightly different setups there, running Russell had a bit more downforce, Hamilton had a bit less downforce. He was getting in the straights, Russell theoretically getting in the corners, but we know Hamilton around Montreal, around Canada is unbelievable around that track in general, at least through his time in racing in Formula 1, so he's pretty much going to maximise the package that he had this weekend. Drove a great race, and yeah, obviously this gap is much smaller than it has been since Spain, pretty much the same as it was in Spain, to be honest, around a track that theoretically I don't think Mercedes thought they were going to be as competitive rounds as they were in Spain, like especially considering what happened back in Baku, right? So probably, even given this whole drama, right, and what they want to do with the rule changes and all this other stuff, I'm sure they're still going to be pushing for that, but I imagine they're definitely much more positive coming out of this weekend about the potential of their car, and seemingly Hamilton is as well, like when it's actually working well for him, than they were going into the weekend, I would imagine. As Hamilton says after his podium, they're a little bit too quick for us still, Red Bull, Ferrari, but we're getting closer, right? Saying that's okay, they're closing up the gap. Mercedes, when they get it right, like they could be there and thereabouts. Around a track like Silverstone, who knows what's going to happen? We'll talk about that in the video very shortly indeed. Just to mention mention this before you finish out because it's so remarkable that it definitely is worthy of mention. The fact that after, 9 races or whatever we've had now, Hamilton is on 77 points, Valtteri Bottas on 44 points, right? Of course, the driver numbers, Hamilton's is 44 and Bottas is 77. It's kind of incredible how that one's managed to work out. But certainly very intrigued to your thoughts on all this stuff in the comments section below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new as always, take care of yourselves, and I will see you next time.